Welcome to this presentation of the Rotary Club of North Bethesda, Maryland, USA. Our club was established in 1974. We meet every Friday morning at 7:45 a.m., and we often invite guest speakers to give presentations on all kinds of interesting subjects. Please contact us through our website at nbrotary.org. And thanks for watching. Our speaker today is North Bethesda Rotary Club member Claes G, who will be talking about the ethics of American constitutionalism.
Good morning, all.
Good morning.
My topic is the ethics of American constitutionalism. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the American system of government presupposes a certain understanding of human nature and society. It assumes that a certain type of conduct is admirable, highly desirable, and that other types of conduct are incompatible with this form of government. Now, that's the central question. What are the moral, ethical presuppositions of American constitutionalism? And because of what's on everybody's mind these days, I'm going to tie that question of the ethics of constitutionalism to another question, which is, can American constitutionalism survive? You don't have to be a worrywart to ask yourself that question. We all know about January 6th. Mass demonstrations in Washington, D.C., hundreds of thousands of people who dispute the legitimacy of the existing established order. You had the invasion of the Capitol building. And don't forget, the previous summer, we had in numerous American cities for weeks protests, riots, burnings, plunder, defilement of monuments, even killing. This took place on a large scale for a very, very long time, although for various reasons, the American media did not report that as much as they did what happened on January 6th. But you had, that is to say, a prelude to what happened on January 6th. You have people all across the spectrum who seem to carry around deep, deep suspicions, frustrations regarding the existing state of affairs. Now, it's a danger that we get caught up in the emotions and the political passions of the moment. And I think it's a good time to just pull back and to try to be a little bit more historical and philosophical as we think about the nature of American constitutionalism. And I think I have to start there by talking about two forms of popular government, or democracy, as we would like to say. We describe them by using the same term, democracy. But there are forms of democracy that are virtually antithetical to each other, incompatible. Now, what notions of democracy are conceivable? There are, of course, variants. There are mixtures of these two forms, but these are the basic forms. One is the belief, and it is a very recent origin. It's something that starts to acquire force, momentum, in as late as the 18th century in the Western world. Prior to that, nothing could have been further from the minds of the big thinkers than to think that democracy in any sense was a good idea. But now, because of thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, the philosopher of the French Revolution, the idea gains ground that the people, in the sense of the popular majority, ought to govern society. Now, I pointed out that there's always an ethics of any form of popular government and of any form of government. And what is the ethics, the moral philosophy behind this new idea of democracy, the Rousseauistic one? It is that contrary to the old Western view, human beings are, this is the Rousseauistic idea, are basically good. If we sometimes show dastardly traits, that's not due to our inherent human nature. It's due to our having been forced to live under perverse social conditions, bad institutions. What is needed in order for human beings to show their goodness and to exude the brotherhood of man, to really care about each other, is for there to be a sort of cleansing of all traditional habits and institutions. Get rid of all of that, and you will get rid of that which poisons human beings so that they become greedy and power hungry and all of that. Now, according to the older Western view, the ancient view, which is classical, Christian, Jewish, Roman, human beings are divided beings. They have noble traits. They can be courageous. They can be concerned for other people. They can behave nobly, but they have to fight a fight all the time against the darker side of their own nature. Society, civilization, families, groups, associations are there to assist human beings in overcoming their lower natures. Now, what is this lower nature? Christianity used to talk about original sin. That's traditional Christianity, which has been replaced. The primary task of human beings is to try to restrain that which is low and sordid in their own personalities. If they're able to do that, they become easier to live with as spouses, as friends, as employers, as employees. That is, whatever little goodness and responsibility that human beings are able to build up with the support of a sound society and family redounds to the benefit of everybody else. That is, a good society can emerge from a large number of people undergoing this kind of self-reform. Humanity can show its better angels, to use an old phrase. But you must never forget, you have to be watchful. Even the noblest human beings are prone not just to flaws, but sometimes to atrocious conduct. That's the old view of human nature. We have a job to do. It's not government that has a job to do. We personally have to do the job that nobody else can do, namely to clean up our own act insofar as it's possible. That's the rock bottom foundation of any good society. If that is not done, forget about everything else. You're going to be dealing with mere appearances of goodness, while the bad side of human nature is advancing behind the pretty facade. Okay, why am I saying this? Because in the 18th century, Rousseau, followed by any number of other people, say, that is the most profound, perverse misunderstanding of the human condition. Human beings, Rousseau announced, is by nature good, born good. And society, this rotten, warped society that we have, has perverted our goodness. So what needs to happen is that we sweep away all of the old stuff and let human goodness flow. And the proper form of government, in keeping with this understanding of human nature, is to let the people rule. They're good people, they're trustworthy. You don't have to fear other people, provided they have been set free from these perverse notions, ancient notions. So the ideal of democracy that is now propounded is that the people, in the sense of the majority, at any particular time, must rule. They must get what they want when they want it. No need to fear what a majority could do to a minority, for example. Trust the goodness of human nature and welcome the, welcome, the brotherhood of man. It's about time. Now that's one ethics of popular government. Were the framers of the US Constitution believers in popular government? Well, that depends on what you mean. And this is where I get to another understanding of popular rule, which is really antithetical to what I just talked about. If you read the Federalist Papers, you all know about the Federalist Papers. These are papers that were written to defend the new Constitution that had been adopted in Philadelphia in 1987. Three people in particular are writing these papers. They're explaining the thinking behind the new Constitution. And one of the things you find there is a deep, deep suspicion of what they call democracy. And you say, what? Isn't America supposed to be the pioneer of democracy in the world? No, that is the opposite of what the framers had in mind. But keep in mind now, I'm talking about different understandings of democracy. The democracy they were thinking about is the kind of democracy that had been scorned in ancient Western civilization, whether it was Greek or Roman or Christian. You take somebody like Thomas Aquinas, for example. Does he support democracy? No. He is with Aristotle completely. Aristotle is the one who argues, and he is here on the same wavelength as Plato. He's saying that democracy, in the sense of popular rule, majoritarian rule, is what happens when a society has spiritually, intellectually, and morally deteriorated enough so that the virtuous and the wise, the knowledgeable, have been sidelined. For Plato and Aristotle and the Romans, it's taken for granted that the people you need to lead a society are the ones who are distinguished by virtue and wisdom. A good society will tend to push people like that into the foreground and give them authority. That is, for Plato and Aristotle, just. It benefits all concerned. It benefits, not least, the common people, to have leaders who are in the business, not for their own sake, but genuinely to try to improve the lot of all in the society. Plato famously writes about democracy as a period when the worst people are in the saddle, when those who know the least about things get politicians who cater to them, pander to their every whim, people who are good at demagoguery, but who are nothing like the benevolence that they always exude to be the people's friends. And I might mention to you that according to this view, the Platonic, the Aristotelian view, which becomes also the Roman view later on, in Cicero, for example, democracy, as they understand it, is the prelude to tyranny, ruled by one bad man in his own interest. But he's put into power by a corrupt society and by corrupt people who have been pandered to by opportunistic politicians. So, far from being the culmination of the search for good government, democracy, according to this older Western view, is not rock bottom, but something that precedes rock bottom, which is tyranny, dictatorial power. All right. Now you know why it is that the framers had a prejudice against democracy. In that sense, there's to say majoritarian government, popular rule according to the momentary will of the people, meaning the mass of humanity. Were they opposed to popular government? No, obviously not. By the standards of the time, the Constitution of 1987 was very progressive, very popular in orientation. You've all heard about Alexis de Tocqueville, the French nobleman who wrote the famous book, Democracy in America. He, the French aristocrat, took note of the fact that this was a popular government by the standards of the time. But you read the Federalist Papers, you read the text of the Constitution, and you see that the framers are taking great precautions against a majority taking command of the government. What they fear more than anything else is a concentration of power. They're almost obsessed with seeing to it that power will be divided, that it will be decentralized, that it will be checked. Checks and balances is what they're looking for. Why? Because they are scared of human nature. Can you believe that? What is there about human nature to be afraid of? Well, we can draw up a list. You look at something like the Ten Commandments in the Western religious tradition, moral tradition. It's warnings all over, all across the board of what human beings tend to do when they shouldn't do it. Remember St. Paul, that which I do, I should not do, and nevertheless I do it. It's the old battle against self. And that is very much on the minds of the framers. You have to check the bad side of human nature, starting with self-control, which they all assumed would be taking place because America was, after all, a Christian country steeped in classical learning. This is something that is for modern human beings very hard to understand. That the American framers lived and breathed the Bible, even those who were religious freethinkers. They lived and breathed the classical heritage. Now, if you wonder about this, let me prove it to you in the most tangible way. Look around in Washington, D.C. when you go downtown the next time. Look at the official buildings. Look at the official monuments. What do you find? Classical, especially Roman, Greek buildings. The Capitol. It's even called the Capitol. Where does that come from? Capitolium. Some of you have been in Rome and seen the original. These are people who think as the old representatives of Western civilization, essentially Christian civilization thought. They would write letters to each other. Let's say Thomas Jefferson to John Adams. And what would they do? They would quote Greek poetry to each other to make a point. In Greek. It was not possible during the era of the so-called American founding to get into the leading academic institutions without already knowing Greek. Greek. Are you hearing this? You had to know the way the ancients thought because they were admired. These were people, these were wise, insightful people. They had warnings and they had encouragements. The Bible was, of course, in every home and it was read. And I repeat, even somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who was an outsider among the framers of the US Constitution, knew that way of thinking, although he had in him much of the Rousseauistic dreamer. He was, among the people in the framing generation, the one who most leaned in the direction of what you might call democracy in the new way. One of the reasons he wanted federalism, very strong federalism and strong state government, is that he wanted the average people to have decisive influence over policy. The framers of the US Constitution did want the people to have decisive influence, but they wanted to take precautions so that no one interest might dominate and lord it over everybody else. Something that you find all over the Constitution are precautions taken to see to it that the weak, the minorities, would be able to stand up to the powerful, to bullies. How do you discern that? Well, in some obvious ways. The US Senate, by the way, I should say in passing, was originally not supposed to be popularly elected at all. That changed in 1913. These senators, 2 from each state, were to represent the state legislatures so that they would be people who had already passed through an extended vetting process so that it could be determined that they had what it took to have that sort of important position. But how many senators from each state? Delaware gets 2. How many people in Delaware? I don't know. Is it 700,000, 800,000 or something? How many senators does California get? 2. Now, according to the Rousseauistic notion of democracy, majoritarian notion of democracy, that's anti-democratic. Well, that is what the framers liked about having 2 senators from each state. It should be possible for the small states to assert themselves against the big states, that if they had their way, they would completely dominate everything. Now, there is, of course, under the Constitution, a more democratic ingredient in that the House of Representatives has members according to the population of the particular state. But even there, the numerical standard is not kept to rigorously because the Constitution decrees that every state has to have at least 1 member of the House, at least 1, even if they don't reach the average for a congressional representative. And as you know, there are states that have at-large members of the House. They have only 1 congressman. So, and another example of the same thing, that the framers were not thinking about popular government as majoritarian numerical majorities. It's this. You all know about the Electoral College. The Electoral College has as many members from each state as the state has congressional representation. That is 2 plus the members of the House who have been apportioned, which gives, again, some extra clout to the smaller states. This is on purpose. Understand that. This is deliberate policy to ensure that the little guys will not be trampled upon, so that, for example, rural people will not be dictated to by people in the big cities. You can imagine if America were to be governed according to the Rousseauistic majoritarian model, New York and Los Angeles and a few other places would be so well represented in various institutions that the agrarian states would be dictated to. They would have no clout. So what was it that the American framers were most afraid of? Well, power in general. It had to be kept in check. It had to be decentralized and divided. But a majority faction. Nothing is worth from the perspective of the good of the whole than the majority faction. That is some group reaching majority status that is agreed on some particular interest and that is able to ram that interest through. That is hellish, according to the framers of the Constitution. That means that the common good will be trampled, the minority will be trampled. So they took special precautions to make sure that a majority would not be able to dictate government policy. That was the design. We have to protect ourselves against that eventuality. This brings me to the question of why and in what sense America is a republic. Why, by the way, is it called a republic? America, as you all know, is supposed to be a new country that has nothing to do with the old days. It broke away from Europe. It's a youthful country. Well, why call yourself a republic if that is what you want? Some of you may have studied Latin back in high school even, and you know the word res. All of you know it now because of email. You know, there's a subject line, RE. Those of you who don't already know it, let me tell you what that means. Re is the ablative of res, the the Latin word for the thing, the subject. Republic means being concerned about the public thing, the common good. This is the idea that comes out of the ancient heritage, that the purpose of government is not that a particular group be in charge, but that the common interest be served. The weak with the strong, the rich with the poor. This is something that is very much on the minds of the classical thinkers, and it's very much on the minds of the framers of the Constitution. You have to watch the rich guys, the big financiers. They tend to put their imprint on everything and run roughshod over everybody else. Now you might say, well, isn't America an oligarchy where plutocracy reigns? Yeah, it has become that. The big finance interests have an enormous influence in America today, which is why you might wonder if America is not today more of an oligarchy than a constitutional republic. So back to constitutional republic. A republic is a regime that is set up to serve the common good and to try to ensure that policy is made not on the spur of the moment, not according to some opinion poll as to what the people want at any particular time, but so as to ensure that America is governed by the deliberate sense of the people over time. Through representation, that is, the common people, they elect leaders whom they trust to make decisions. Those leaders are expected to deliberate on the merits of policy, to look at the facts, to cool the passions. Speaking of cooling the passions, why were the senators giving 6-year terms? From the point of view of majoritarian democracy, that's ridiculous. That means that they are free to do as they please for 6 years. Yeah, right. That's what the framers wanted. They wanted to ensure at least the opportunity for some people genuinely to deliberate, think things through, and observe this, even go against the popular wishes of the moment if they thought that the people was being rash. And it was not inconceivable, according to their view, that a congressman who has gone against the wishes of the people would not be reelected. Because the people back home might well come to their senses and say, boy, that guy's got guts. He went against our explicit wishes on this, but yes, he knew what he was doing. And even though I disagree with him still, I would like to have that sort of person representing me. Somebody who's trying to call them as he sees it, even if it should cost him his job. Now that is an example of what I call the constitutional personality. It's the person who will not let the opportunities, the advantages of the moment overpower his own thinking about issues. He owes it to people to give them his genuine point of view, even if it should cost him politically. That is the sort of mentality that the framers hoped would be influential in the system of government. They set up a system which put a premium on deliberation, 6-year terms for senators. You examine the pros and cons of issues. You listen to other people. And you do not shunt the minority aside. After all, the minority may, as is often the case, be right. You know, if you look back in history, who are the people who are admired by us these days? The dissenters. You know, it used to be the mainstream opinion that the earth is the center of the universe. The majority went after them, but they stood their ground. And so it continues. That is, if you think the way the framers did, and if you think about the way the leading representatives of Western civilization thought in the old days, you would always be suspicious of the majority view. It's usually wrong. It's too short-sighted, too passionate. To make decisions in a dispassionate manner, that is what they were trying to make room for. Okay, I want to make sure that we have some time for comments and questions. So let me just add one point. Suppose that for one reason or another, people will no longer exhibit the sort of character traits that the American system of constitutionalism requires. I remind you of Benjamin Franklin's famous statement to a woman who ran up to him after the Constitutional Convention and who asked, "What have you come up with? What kind of government are we going to have? Is it going to be a monarchy or what?" And Franklin famously said, "A republic if you can keep it." Now, what you suppose would be the difficulty of keeping it? It required for its maintenance a rather extraordinary sort of person, a law-abiding person, a person of self-restraint, a person of character who's willing to listen to the other side. Is that how the traits that you recognize as natural in your grandchildren and the babies and the people who are in the playground? Is their natural predisposition to let other kids play with their toys, et cetera, et cetera? It doesn't come naturally to human beings to exhibit the traits of the constitutional personality. You have to be prepared. You have to struggle with yourself, with the assistance of community, family, church, whatever influences there are. But my point is this, to get back to the heart of the matter of the ethics of American constitutionalism. American constitutionalism stands and falls with the constitutional personality. So the question is, when we ask about the future of American constitutionalism, are we producing constitutional personalities en masse? People who struggle to achieve moral character, who struggle with themselves, who contend with original sin or whatever you're talking about? Or are we bringing up people of a different sort? Well, if we're failing in the task of cultivating the constitutional personality, America's constitutional republic cannot continue. I'm not suggesting either case, but I'm suggesting that you reflect on that matter. I'll stop there.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I think this will require more discussion, but I'm just questioning your fundamental. I read several times actually the Federalist Papers a long time back, about 10 years back. My question to you as a historian or the political scientist of history, and I could be wrong, what I'm saying here. As I read the Homo sapiens, and what I came to the conclusion that the human nature is so greedy, going back to 5,000 years or beyond that even, is basically there are really no real democracies in the world. What it is basically special interest groups, wherever they are, throughout the history. They are dominating economic interests. It could be the religious interests. It could be some other interests, hereditary interests. So throughout the world, throughout the history, what you're looking at is not real democracies, it's the dominance by the might of the people.
Okay.
I think that's what my fundamental, so human nature has not changed. You refer to Western civilization, you talk about the Greeks and the Romans and so on, and the same people dominated the rest of the world without considering the democracy.
Yeah,
so I think there's a fundamental flaw in this whole process, what you are describing to us.
But it's strange that you would say that, because what you're saying is completely implied in what I've been saying. I just didn't concentrate on it. By the way, I knew that was what you were going to ask. You always ask that question in one form or another.
Yeah.
And I would begin by saying that you are, in a sense, absolutely right. The ancient thinkers, I could have spent a lot of time on this, would have warned against exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Plutocracy. They hate plutocracy.
Yeah.
Greedy, narrow-minded people who exploit others.
Yeah.
Yes, you are right. Because of the nature of human beings, oligarchy, greed tends to color everything that happens. And so one way of putting the moral problem that I was trying to describe is to say, how do you rein in the oligarchs? Now, the oligarchs are not the only troublemakers. You have simple power politicians. You have horrendous generals. You have Napoleon types. You have Stalin types. Are they oligarchs? Well, in one sense, they're oligarchs because elites always rule, especially in democracies. That's something that is held against democracies by Plato and Aristotle, that they're never really democracies. Behind the scenes, behind the elections, there are people who frame questions so that the outcome is always guaranteed. And we make a big to-do about whether we're going to have Trump or we're going to have Biden. Well, the oligarchs get what they want. Namely, this is the crux of the matter. Namely, when constitutional Republican precautions break down. Now, you're saying, because you're more of a cynic than the framers of the US Constitution, that the oligarchic tendency, although it is very strong, can be contained. It has happened, but it's always a more or less. Now, something that I think speaks in the favor of the American framers is that they took human nature as it is. They didn't dream about humanity really being golden deep down, that human beings are good. I mean, that's the sort of brotherhood of man mentality that has had tremendous influence in the Western world, including the United States. They did not even give that notion a thought. They knew that the sort of thing that you're talking about is a reality. Greed, cruelty, whatever you want, it's always there. And the crux of the matter is, can we contain it? They tried to contain it. And you may want to say they were naive in attempting it. I'm not sure I want to go that far. But this is why it is hard to keep a republic. A republic, if you can keep it, if you fall down on the job of producing solid citizens, people of self-restraint, sense of the common good and responsibility, constitutionalism goes down, and what you're talking about, the oligarchic temptation, gets back in the saddle without restraint. So, I mean, when you bring up that, as you regularly do, I always say, yeah, we know, I know. We all know that. That's the problem that the framers were trying to contain. But they were worried, perhaps that won't succeed. And perhaps you're saying they were naive. Look around us. American constitutionalism is falling apart.
Boss, I have
Kevin.
I have an observation.
Okay.
If you go way back in time and you look at anthropology and why the human beings became the dominant species, it's because our ability to communicate and to work together as a group. Now, we call them tribes, okay? But we do have, if you look at primitive groups, they work together as a group. So there is this this has been inculcated. I don't disagree with what you're saying, by the way, but I'm saying there is a basic motivation to work together for a common good. Now, does every human being have that in modern society? Absolutely not. No, I'm not. But I'm saying if you go way back, that's why human beings became the predominant animal on this planet. Our brains, our smartness, and our ability to work together, to feed, to house, and that sort of thing. We did things other animals couldn't, but we only could do it as a community.
Kent,
Now, the community's got very, very large, and now you start getting into what Bob was talking about, and you have competing interests. So I agree with what you're saying about human motivation, but you take it, I don't think you took it to the next step. What makes it successful? What makes it successful is the ability for people to compromise. That's what, if you look at our Constitution, that's the end product, to force people to acknowledge the interests of the other group and come to compromise.
That's
when
what
it
I
breaks
stress.
down, it's when there aren't enough people who are seeing that community and working successfully towards compromise. And that's why we have so much dysfunction now. I go back to when I was in my 20s and 30s, and I didn't agree with what a lot of the politicians said, but I trusted our government because they compromised, and maybe they came out with decisions I didn't particularly agree with on occasion, but most of the time they were looking for the common good, whether it would be Republican or whether it be the Democrat. And what we have today is we have people that are unwilling to compromise. They're unwilling to promote the greater good, and rather they're taking a look at how my group, my tribe, can stay in power.
Right.
And that's the lack of compromise I see is the problem today, because the ultimate goal of our Constitution is to arrive at compromise.
I agree completely with that. And I don't know why you thought that I didn't get to that. I thought that was what I emphasized. That is the importance of trying to achieve compromise despite the drawbacks of human nature.
You never used the word compromise. What? Never.
Well, I think I did, but even if I didn't, there are other words for the same thing. Okay. But in any case, I think you're right that we have arrived at a moment, maybe it's a post-constitutional moment, when partisanship becomes unbridled. You know, something to have come out of the tensions of the last several years is that we recognize that now we don't really have newspapers in the old sense. We don't have TV channels. We have propagandists of different kinds. They may call themselves journalists, but they aren't journalists. You turn on Fox News and you get participants in political mobilization or in political propaganda. You turn to the Washington Post, you get the same thing. I mean, the Washington Post was always a liberal-leaning paper, but today it's a paper written by Democrats for Democrats, and they don't even attempt to hide that. And you can read articles that if I were a teacher of journalism, I would have to go through with a red pen, things you cannot do as a journalist. But this happens all the time, and I think this will support your point that when you're not genuinely interested in the facts of a matter, but when you're always pushing a partisan interest, we all suffer. If you don't have media who are watchful against the oligarchs, watchful against everything that undermines constitutional government, we are in deep trouble.
I have a question.
Yeah, Ken.
I remember maybe it was just shortly before or after the election, you made a comment at a Rotary meeting that you were genuinely terrified about this viability of the American Republic and all the system, constitutional system. Where do you stand now on the Klaus meter? Is it closer, higher? Where are you now?
I'm not sure I said, did I use the word terrified?
I'm greatly concerned.
Yeah, yes. Well, cheerfulness keeps breaking in, you know. But yes, I think that what's happening to America is deeply, deeply concerning. I have not changed my mind. And Deputy just mentioned this. Something like 65 to 70% of all Republicans believe that the last election was stolen. Something like 15 to 20% of all Democrats believe that the last election was stolen. What does that tell you about a deep, deep distrust of the established order, whatever that is? And back to Bob's point, I think behind much of this is a deep, deep suspicion of the oligarchs. You know, things, and you have somebody like Fauci, for example, who turns out to be a kind of representative of large interests. Now, here I'm getting into territories where controversies are, you know, galore. But in general, I think the situation is deeply troubling.
Well, can I make a comment that at the time of the Federalist Papers, they were attempting to sell the approval of the Constitution and the theory behind the what we call the Electoral College was because they had no thought even that the president would be elected by popular vote. It was totally not consideration. The electors were going to be selected by the state legislatures, and then they would determine who was going to be the president. So it was quite isolated from anything involving a popular vote.
Excellent point. Excellent point. I normally make that point in this sort of context, but that again supports what I was saying, that they were deeply suspicious of throwing some decisions out to people who would be unqualified to make the decision. That is, who would the electors be? The electors would be, they couldn't be federal office holders, but right. They would be people trusted by the state legislatures, people who had risen through the ranks, who were experienced, known for their good judgment. They would make the selection of a president, partly because they might even know the contenders. They would know that George Washington has bad teeth or wooden teeth, but boy, he has integrity.
Yeah. So we are at the bottom of the hour or a little bit beyond, and I know some folks probably need to go, and I'm not sure if there's any more questions. So I will.
I have a question.
Hang on one second. So those that need to go, please feel free. Have a wonderful week. Stay warm, stay dry, and appreciate that. And then Klaus, if you can stay on, I think we've got a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. You know, I hold my hand, but nobody pay attention. Klaus, thank you. You know, it's a little difficult topic for early morning, but anyway, you know, my question is, I know I see and I listen a lot of very, very smart analysis, you know, smart people around. But my question is it existing some mechanism to change, you know, to change government, can change the politics organization? Look, Russia. Can you imagine in China it will be changed? No. You know, Burma, what is May something named different? It's a military, you know, took power. What is you know, mechanism to change it for better?
Well, under the Constitution, the mechanism is to amend the Constitution, and it's been done on numerous occasions. And other than that, a question I'm asking myself is if America is not already something like a Latin American republic. It used to be something very different. And what are the so-called banana republics like? Well, for example, once a new regime comes in, what does it do? It goes after, criminally, the previous office holders. They charge them with various things, and so it goes. And then another regime comes in, and it goes after its opponents. And the general criminalization of political dissent, I think, is a particularly worrisome phenomenon. The new Attorney General who came in made a major point when he said that he saw it as a purpose of his tenure to go after what he called political extremism. And I thought to myself, what? Political extremism? There are laws in the books for going after people who are behaving in unacceptably conspiratorial ways. The FBI are looking for people like that all the time. What he was saying was that we need to make some sort of special effort to go after people who have views very different. I mean, that it seems to me that that should be par for the course. You always carefully observe people who might undermine the regime. The fact that he would say this seemed to me an indication that we're entering upon a new era. Back to the banana republic. I don't want to overdo that analogy, but America, I think, is starting to resemble what we used to call banana republics. And that means that we're flirting in various ways with dictatorship. You know, the pattern in Latin America is the Democrats foul things up beyond belief, and the military steps in to try to get some order into things. And so
General Flynn, right?
Well, whatever. It's, this is that we're even thinking along those lines is to me bothersome.
I think you can recall the cries to lock her up during the previous administration, right?
Actually, if I may come close, I mean, this a great graduate class, I think, in 4 hours, not half an hour for this.
Yes, yes.
Different thinking, and that's why it's America. I mean, we have thinking like yours, and you have thinking like in the middle, or thinking to the other side. But it's interesting conversation to see thinking of this nature at this elitist level or aristocratic level like yours, a university professor and so on, because people always had misunderstanding of the, I think, developments over the last few years or a decade, how people think. I mean, I took a lot of good things about it. I mean, you said that Constitution or the framers, they thought very carefully, intensely about protecting the rights of the minorities and the weak. But I also take exception to when you say that they were they're prejudiced against democracy. I think the American experience of the Constitution has been the best of effort in the world, that people knew how to try to reflect people's opinion. Yes, we get corrupted over the years to the political action committees and money in the area. So that said, I thought that is an exception. I want to make a few other comments. You know, you kept saying brotherhood. It's a brother and sisterhood. We don't discount the 52% of the population that reflects. And there was the old thinking, and you're right. The old thinkers thought man is the only one who can vote and decide the destiny of the country. So, I mean, you know, a few things. And I also took note that January 6th, you say trouble, not an insurrection, but you also bring the banana republics where the unelected people or elected people are thrown out, unelected people takes over. It happened in Africa just, I think, 2-3 days ago, a few days ago. So I mean, you know, a lot of thinking. Actually, I worked under a man named Dr. Kyriakakis when I was a graduate student, and he, of course, I'm foreign born, and I was new in the country, but he let me teach a class on American government politics, teaching assistant. So, I mean, there are a lot of thinking. It differs so kind of diverse to the both ends. So, interesting to note.
You know, since I was talking about the ethics of
and also one of the point I want to say, I think that the framers of the Constitution, although they were what is it called, quakes and kind of belief system, I don't think they projected this country or nation to be a Christian country. I think that's what they're trying to get away from European tyranny, or tyranny in Europe. So, of course, majority rules, and Christian belief is predominant because it's a predominantly Christian majority country. So, as a political scientist, I thought that it will help us to, or political scientists like you, to help us understand that background.
Well, of course, they didn't set up a Christian republic. That goes without saying. But they also did not set up a wall of separation between church and state. That phrase appears nowhere in the American Constitution. As a matter of fact, when the Constitution was written, it was fairly common in the several states for there to be religious requirements for holding office, especially up in the New England states. But of course, a separation of church and state was assumed. And what they were, when they addressed that issue, it was to make sure that there would be no national religious establishment as there was a Church of England. They were worried, as a matter of fact, that those Episcopalians, who were about 50% of the delegates in Philadelphia, would want to have something like the Church of England. But the Episcopal Church, which is the descendant of the Church of England today, is called the Protestant Episcopal Church. That is to say, it's very clear, even within Episcopal Church, Anglican Church tradition in this country, that church and state are separate.
Can I make one comment before we go? And that is that we are scheduled to support the Nourishing Bethesda again on the 2nd of July, Friday, the 2nd of July.
That's the Episcopalian Church, right?
For the Episcopal Church, yes.
Yeah, no,
just make you light up.
John's, right?
Thank you. It's a good job. That is a great job.
Good.
Dan is bringing up something that I might have brought up here. Christians always talk about loving God and neighbor as selves. I mean, the Roman Catholics, Protestants, they say the same thing. But everything depends on definition. What does love mean? The emphasis in the old Western civilization, in old Christianity, was always on the fact that the individual has to do the best possible effort with himself so as to become capable of loving neighbor. Doing, for example, what Dan and many others are doing in association with that particular Episcopal Church. That is what tends to happen when traditional Christian morality dominates, is that locally and concretely and personally things are being done. The Rousseauistic notion of brotherhood of man or love takes a completely different form. That form is for large collectives to be served, and large collectives somewhere in the distance. The suffering, the hungry, people whom you don't know, and who are so numerous that you personally can't be expected to do very much. Government has to be mobilized to handle it. It's a sort of collectivized, politicized love, which has almost nothing to do with traditional Christian love, or for that matter, Muslim conceptions of the same thing. The traditional view is always that we owe something to those in our immediate vicinity, our spouses, our children, our wider community, our Rotary Club, and so on and so forth. If we have some time and energy left over, we may turn our minds also to people in the greater distance. But the emphasis, this is something that de Tocqueville observed about America. Americans are not individualists. Forget that. They are joiners. This is what Ken talked about. They, to a far greater extent than Europeans, they pool their resources, get things done, Episcopal Church style. That's what love means in the concrete. And it has nothing, virtually nothing to do with some sort of love of humanity, a sort of cloying sentimentalism. If you turn from the up-close personal conception of love to the other stuff, then your communities will start to deteriorate and morality will be assumed by some distant authority, government, some very distant authority to which you send a check for taxes.
But isn't the government supposed to reflect at least the idea, sentiment of the people? When a person on my level can only give $10 as charity, I think collectively give $10 million. So a government is formed by the people, of the people, for the people, is to do good for the people in a group, as the original thinking was, not on an individualistic point of view. No, isn't it true?
Of course. The problem of oligarchy that Bob keeps returning to is very real. Greed in general is very real. And in a republic, you contend with that in various ways. It may be by taxation or whatever means. But the key point is that what generates a decentralized society where power is dispersed is something like grassroots love of neighbor. Have you thought about why it's talk about love of neighbor? Neighbor? That person across the street whom I can't stand? Well, we're supposed to stand that person, but we're not going to be able to act lovingly toward that person unless we've done a lot of work on ourselves. To ask ourselves, for example, why do we despise that guy so much? That's the job that we are supposed to do. Work on ourselves with the help of the surrounding society, churches, etc., etc. And that work never ends. That's the heart of the matter. Notice that love of humanity is something very simple and very different. Anybody can do that. You can be a shit and exude benevolence for humanity. You can squeeze a tear out of the corner of your eye and say, I am such a deeply caring person. From the point of view of traditional Christianity, who cares about that? You show in your actions who you are. What actions? Your actions toward people up close. Everybody knows who you are. And if you fake it, everybody will know. The trouble is that very often the greatest lovers of humanity are also the most murderous. Stalin was a great lover of mankind.
Is that right?
So was Mao.
Wow.
He was an idealist. He was an idealist if ever there was one. And so was Pol Pot. Pol Pot, by the way, was really drunk on the readings of Rousseau. Brotherhood of Man stuff. Brotherhood of Man, watch it. People who have that, they're coming for you sooner or later.